I'm glad to introduce Dr. Eduardo Morales, who is here to tell us about his career path for the APS SSCP How Did I Get Here video series. Dr. Morales received his Ph.D. in counseling psychology from Texas Tech University in 1976. Dr. Morales is Distinguished Professor and Interim Program Director in the Department of Psychology at Alliant International University in San Francisco. His work focuses on interventions for adolescents and community prevention in areas such as substance use and HIV in ethnic and sexual minorities. In addition, Dr. Morales is the Executive Director of AGUILAS, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting health and well-being in a culturally sensitive environment for gay and bisexual Latinos. He has received numerous honors, including a Fulbright Fellow Specialist designation and an American Psychological Association Award for distinguished contributions to institutional practice. In addition, Dr. Morales has engaged in many service activities, including becoming an elected member to the APA Council of Representatives, representing Division 44, Society for the Psychological Study of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Issues. Dr. Morales, please describe your career path and tell us about any obstacles or barriers that you overcame along the way. In addition, tell us what has surprised you about your path and your current job and what you wish you had known earlier about these types of positions.
Welcome, everybody. And I think you're on a good career path because there's a lot of things to do as a psychologist and a lot of paths that you can take. Originally, I'm from New York City, which is different than being from, although I've been in California for many, many years, maybe I think 36, 37 years now, so it's been a long time. But I slowly migrated from the East Coast to the West Coast after I graduated. But in any event, I was very involved when I was living in New York with community affairs. At that time, psychology was positioned very, very differently than what it was now. It was very much strongly psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, most of the programs. There were only like 16, 17 programs accredited by APA for counseling psych at the time. It was heavily competitive in that the only thing that was more competitive to get into graduate school were veterinary schools. It was more competitive than medical school. So it was a very, very different climate. Also, psychology was going through different, it was a different climate for psychologists. It was not the issue of inclusion that you hear now. The social justice is a new term really that's been coming to the floor about the last 5, 6 years. You know, before that, maybe you could call it civil rights, maybe you can call it, human justice before that, but nevertheless, psychology was really not involved in those issues. In fact, when I was going to graduate school, homosexuality was a disease, and you could be kicked out of graduate school. Now, this is a huge barrier, and as things evolved in 73, the Psychiatric Association, followed by in 74, Psychological Association, removed it as a disorder. And then things started to change. One different thing that the psychologists did was said, well, we're responsible for the stigma. We have to deal with the stigma. And that's not true with what the psychiatrists have done. But in any event, moving forward, I decided to, I liked working with children and adolescents. That's kind of how I started a lot of my career, doing a lot of stuff on psychological testing. It was in the 70s. There was a lot of controversy about testing minority children and misplacing them in schools, and there were civil lawsuits against that. Things like that was going on. And so I actually did my dissertation was on that, looking at examiner effects with bilingual children who were early elementary children, looking at bilingual children versus monolingual children who were Latinos. But in any event, moving forward, I got a job working in my internship at Washington, D.C., working at D.C. General in their inpatient unit and also the D.C. General Children's Adolescent Unit. And then I moved on to getting a job in Sacramento, which I worked for a couple of years. But then, I'm really a city boy, so I decided to move to San Francisco and been here ever since. The path has been kind of interesting because as you get into this path, there are a lot of ways you can go. Many people think about, I want to do therapy, I want to help people, and do things to reach out to people and deal with the human condition. And most people, go into the field thinking in that. And then after several years, they kind of get tired of the paperwork you have to do, all of the stuff that's connected with it, and they want some more variation in what they do. One thing I found was I had a knack of writing grants and had a knack of founding programs. So a lot of my career path has been to found programs. So, for example, myself and my colleague who has now passed away, we together wrote a grant. It was the first grant that United Way funded on LGBT counseling services in the whole history of United Way here in San Francisco for ethnic minority clients, LGBT clients. And so we launched a program here back in '79. I continued along, and then suddenly we were hit with this AIDS epidemic. So I had my practice, and I then was struck by what can we do as behavioral health professionals in working with this epidemic that everybody was scared about, nobody knew what to do. And at that time, what resulted was there were actually some things that we can do to mediate some of the conditions and help with the quality of life. And so actually I began to develop with a small team, we developed the concept of, well, maybe we can do some interventions, behavioral interventions. And so the health department liked the idea. We wrote a grant to the state. They didn't have the money. The city picked up the grant. They liked it, and they ran with it and started a program called the AIDS Health Project, which has gone through very different iterations since then. But the complexity at the time was, it's the first time that in behavioral health, you were dealing with a whole bunch of consultants, you were dealing with the people who are providing direct line work, you were dealing with the intersect with the Department of Public Health. And this is a very, very new model in providing services at the time, which made it very difficult to implement. I was managing like 5 budgets at one time. It was very, very, just to keep the small project going, which made it quite difficult. Then eventually what happened was there was money from the federal government to do some research in this area. And obviously, at the time, over 40% of the HIV/AIDS cases were in the ethnic minority communities. So it was important for ethnic minority researchers to be involved. And we had to challenge UCSF and the Department of Public Health here in San Francisco and told them downright, if you didn't include us, we'd make sure you won't get funded. So here comes the political work that you have to do to get funded for a project that people would agree is very important to do, and also to be inclusive of ethnic minority researchers and practitioners at the same time. And partnerships with community-based organizations. So again, here's another new model that was generated. And interestingly enough, of the 4 different applications that the federal government received, there were only 2 funded. One was ours, and one was in the University of Miami. And basically because we were able to integrate those concepts into the grant, and then launched actually the first research team on HIV with ethnic minority populations in the United States, with an integrated research team. This was very, very new, very important to do, and we knew very little about how to do this. So it was important to stick with the right scientific methodology moving forward, but yet at the same time have some kind of information that would be useful for the community and have some practical implications so that things could be implemented quickly. You know that if you do research on a pure theoretical frame, it takes 20 years before it goes from the theoretical to the practice. This is like outrageous time frame. So what we need to do is shorten that time frame as much as we can. And so I helped build that agency, helped build that effort that was actually embedded in a community-based organization, which had never had a research team. Now most community-based agencies have to provide data in terms of justifying that they have some kind of impact. But at the time, people were getting funded to do services without showing efficacy, without, doing anything like that. So this was also helpful for the community-based agency to help tool them up and get them revved up to what the future would bring. Moving forward, I moved on to becoming a professor at the California School of Professional Psychology, which now I'm clinical director of the Ph.D. clinical program. And needless to say, when I got into that environment, addressing the multicultural issues was a challenge for faculty. Not unique to this institution, actually it's pervasive throughout the United States, that the inclusion of ethnic minority issues was really lacking in psychology significantly. Also, what was lacking at the time, there wasn't a division of ethnic minority psychology. That happened in the mid-'80s when suddenly psychologists at the APA convention decided, this is a time where we can have a division. And so, we got the signatures and everything. Again, the political aspect of it to move something forward within APA structure so that a division could be formed. Another challenge with that division was, we wanted a journal, and the pervasive idea was, this is not going to sell. Nobody's going to buy this journal, really. What importance can you provide to the field? This is the kind of pushback we were getting. Needless to say, we pushed back to the point where the journal now is one of the most successful journals that APA publishes, and they're quite proud of it. So that was, I guess, the zigzagging here in the career goes to doing some clinical service, launching some services, putting my talents where I feel comfortable in doing some things that I felt most people really couldn't do and can contribute, and then moving forward and then dealing with the political arena around that. Most recently, what's been on the forefront is providing services for Latinos. The challenge in our field is based on how do we respond to the rapidly changing demographics. Do you know that, of course, the largest ethnic group in the United States are Latinos, and 40% of them are monolingual Spanish speakers. There are federal regulations, there are executive orders saying, hey, if somebody speaks a language, you have to provide that service in that language. But the implementation of that really has not really taken hold. And even when I sit on grant review teams on the federal level, I get pushback around that. and I said, excuse me, but how do we implement something that is a federal regulation? So this is a real challenge, because in psychology, we really are not training the workforce to deal with providing services in languages other than English. And, if you happen to speak another language, we presume the person has those skills to use them in a professional setting, which is not necessarily true. So one of the things I've done in my university is done a course on Latino psychology, teaching it bilingually. So we look at vignettes in Spanish. I encourage students to learn the language. There's some good computer-assisted language learning products like Rosetta Stone. University made available Mongo. And also the climate of the university began to change, because we did a lot of work in the university, again, pushing some things forward, so that we were actually one of the first universities to have multicultural competencies for faculty that are tied to compensation. Everybody talks, yeah, it's a good thing, but when it comes down to, well, is my pay going to be related to this? It's absent in terms of the evaluation. It's absent in terms of promotion. So we were one of the first universities that actually developed that, not only for the student body, but also for the faculty. So these are things that were kind of the zigzagging that's happened in my career as I've been moving forward. The latest thing is, in being an executive director, I'm the only executive director of a nonprofit in the entire university. So although some people have a practice, or some people do some contract work, and I also do contract work. I do some program evaluation I just got one for Women on Recovery, and I have my students work with that. But to run a nonprofit organization for a primarily disenfranchised group like Latino LGBT is very, very difficult, because people talk about how important it is, but nobody kind of says, oh, okay, here's the money, or here's the financial opportunity to do it. So what we've done is partner with businesses, not only try to get a contract, but then partner with businesses. I think the latest thing that's come up, I think you've heard in the public's eye, has been the use of cannabis. And here in California, we allow people to use cannabis, provided that they have a medical need. Well, we partnered with actually a philanthropist who wanted to open up a cannabis club, and part of the monies or profits that they make actually go to 4 different nonprofit organizations as a way to complement some of the deteriorating funding streams that occur when you're doing services. Sometimes you get large grant, but then you don't get the increases every year. So you get flat funding for 6, 7, 8 years. Meantime, and there's an inflation rate. So how do you deal with all of that? So these are some of the barriers and challenges to try to keep and address issues going forward, as well as address the workforce. How to give and train people how to work with particular populations going forward, so that they have the varied skills that they need, which is what we do not only in the academic setting, but in my nonprofit. And my students, luckily, I was able to give them, regular jobs, doing the program evaluation on a regular salary base, not the student work study money, which is really underfunding, at poverty rates for student labor. So, so those are some of the zigzaggings that have happened in my career going forward. I hope that really helps you in terms of making your decision of what you want to do with your career.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Morales, for taking the time to tell us about your path, your zigzags. It was very interesting, and we really appreciate your participation.
Okay, take care. Bye. Good luck.